This is chapter 21, Plant Evolution. You will notice this lecture that we don't cover all the material in chapter 21, and your final exam will only be on the material that is covered in this chapter. These are your student learning objectives, which we'll go over at the end of the lecture. So let's talk about plants. Plants are multi-celled photosynthetic eukaryotes. Remember, plants are eukaryotes. And they first appeared 500 million years ago. Green algae that was growing along the water or land edge gave rise to the first land plants. Remember, algae, which we learned in the last chapter, is actually a protist and not a plant. All plant cells have a cell wall made of cellulose and have chloroplasts. So they have a wall around each cell that contains something called cellulose, and then they contain chloroplasts, which are the organelles that do the photosynthesis. Plants evolved from green algae, remember that's a protist, and underwent adaptations for success on land. We're going to talk about those adaptations in a moment. Plants are embryophytes, which form a multi-celled embryo as parental body, also known as seeds. So whenever you guys eat an apple or a peach, you're actually eating a plant embryo. An embryophyte is a member of the land plant clade. So algae had challenges when moving onto land. See, when you move onto land, water was no longer always around, and the plant was no longer standing straight up due to buoyancy, like the algae you're seeing here. Also, the plant could dry out or desiccate, and so the algae had to evolve specific structures to survive. And I expect you guys to know the following structures. The first one is the cuticle. The cuticle is a secreted covering at a body's surface. And we'll talk a little bit more about that cuticle in just a minute. The plants also evolve something called a stoma. That's an opening across the plant's cuticle and epidermis. And what it does is it's going to control for water loss and allow for oxygen and carbon dioxide to be exchanged in the plant. So oxygen will leave the plant and carbon dioxide will go into it. And then it also contains something called vascular tissue. And vascular tissue is just like the vascular tissue inside of us. It's internal pipelines. And the two types of vascular tissue you need to know about plants is the xylem and the phloem. So let's talk about the cuticle first. Plants have waterproof cuticle, and they also have an opening called a stomata. The cuticle basically is what is going to prevent water from being lost through the leaves. So if you've ever seen a plant with really shiny leaves, or a waxy covering, that would be the cuticle, and that's going to protect water from leaving it. The stomata is an open and closing, so it's like a pore in the plant leaf. And what it does is it's going to close to not allow water out, but it may open to let oxygen out or take carbon dioxide in. This is a fantastic video that discusses both the cuticle and the stomata, and I highly recommend that you watch it. Plants also had to evolve vascular tissue when they moved onto land, and the internal vascular tissue is what transports water and nutrients through the plant. I do expect you to know the differences between xylem and phloem, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And vascular tissues are reinforced by something called lignin. If you guys ever eat celery, you know the stringy stuff, that's lignin. What it does is it helps the plant stand upright and allow them to branch. So it's basically what gives the plant that sturdy structure. So xylem is plant vascular tissue that distributes water and dissolved minerals and ions. And phloem is a plant vascular tissue that distributes sugars. So when I ask you on the test which vascular tissue distributes water, you should pick xylem. And if I ask you what vascular tissue transports sugars or food, you should pick phloem. And then lignin is the material that stiffens cell walls of vascular plants. And I always like to think of lignin as like the stringy stuff in celery. That's what makes celery so sturdy and stand upright. Another adaptation is seeds and pollen. So seeds are the result of fertilization of a seed plant, and pollen grains are the male gametophytes that can be dispersed, also known as sperm. Both dispersed without water, right? Because if there's no water around, you need to disperse both your seeds and your pollen in various ways. So it's a very important adaptation that contributes to the success of seed plants. Pollen and seeds allow seed plants to reproduce in dry places, and many seed features facilitate dispersal from the parent plant. So here's an example. We all are familiar with dandelions, and dandelions have adapted to be dispersed in the air because when you blow on a dandelion, all little white fluffy things with the seeds at the end are going to disperse. Here we see ragweed, and when you shake ragweed or the wind blows, that is going to send the pollen out in the air, and the pollen is basically the sperm for the plant. And once it lands on a female plant, it will fertilize that plant. So pollen grains are the male gametophyte of a seed plant, also known as plant sperm. And seeds are basically the embryo, and they're covered with a nutritive tissue inside a waterproof coat. So like think about an apple, it has a nutritive coating around the seeds. There are two lineages of seed plants that you need to know about, gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms were the first to evolve, and whenever you think of a Christmas tree or a pine tree, that would be a gymnosperm. And then angiosperms make flowers and release their seeds inside a plant. So key concepts. There are adaptive trends among plants. Plants evolved from an aquatic green algae, which was a protist, and over time, new traits evolved that made them increasingly adapted to life in dry climates. You guys need to know that the process of adaptation included changes in plant structure, including the cuticle, the stomata, the xylem, and the phloem, and their life cycle, where they release their pollen and their seeds into the air. So the first plants to evolve on Earth were probably the seedless vascular plants. Plants such as club mosses, horsetails, and ferns that have vascular tissue. What's interesting about these plants is that they have flagellated sperm that swim to eggs and disperses by producing spores, not seeds. That's what makes seedless vascular plants different from all other plants. They don't make seeds, hence seedless vascular plants, but instead they make spores, and they also have flagellated sperm, which means that these guys have to live close to water. What's interesting is club mosses, here's a club moss, which is a seedless vascular plant, has a horizontal stem called a rhizome, and that runs along the ground. So it's not really like a regular root. You can see here, here's the rhizome. And what happens is that this is what's going to anchor the plant into the ground. Spores form on the plant, and what they do is they'll release and enter into the water where then they can grow into more club mosses. So a rhizome is a stem that grows horizontally along under the ground. Ferns are the most diverse seedless plants. Ferns, the most diverse group of seedless vascular plants, produces spores or sori, and this is the back of a fern. If you've ever received flowers, you might have noticed that they have these brown dots in the back, and those would be the casings of the spores. Many ferns grow as epiphytes. An epiphyte is a plant that grows on another plant but does not harm it. The example I would give you is a commensal. So this fern is going to grow on a tree to get sunlight, but the tree is not going to benefit from that fern growing on it. And a sorus is a cluster of spore-producing capsules on a fern leaf. So these little brown dots that you see, these are sorus. So these are what contains the spores of the fern plant. So seedless vascular plants, they have internal pipelines that carry materials through the body. So they have xylem and phloem. But the body that makes spores dominates their life cycle. And they also require water for fertilization since they release flagellated sperm. Cichlids and ginkgos are among the earliest gymnosperm lineages. Early angiosperms, such as magnolias, evolved while dinosaurs walked the earth, or flowering plants. Reproductive traits of seed plants. Seed plant sporophytes have pollen sacs, where microspores form and develop into male gametophytes. These are some pretty big words. What you need to know is that pollen sacs are going to make where microspores form into basically sperm. So pollen is sperm. So pollen sacs are the sacs that contain the sperm, and microspores are what become the pollen. These plants also have ovules where megaspores form and develop into female gametophytes. If you think about a female human, we have eggs and ovaries. So think of it as the ovule is the ovaries and the megaspores are what are going to become the egg. So pollen sacs. of a seed plant. This is the reproductive structure in which sperm-bearing gametophytes or pollen grains develop. So basically, a pollen sac is where pollen is going to develop, and these are the male gametophytes or the sperm. And a microspore is basically the cells that are going to make the pollen. A megaspore, on the other hand, is going to be the female part of the reproductive tract. So this is what's going to develop into an egg, and the ovule is basically the reproductive structure in which the egg-bearing gametophyte develops. This is where the egg will develop and get fertilized. So plants usually have both megaspores and microspores. Microspores make sperm or pollen, and think of it this way: sperm is smaller than eggs, and then megaspores are what are going to make the ovule or egg of the female plant. So microspores make pollen and megaspores make ovule or eggs of the plant. So what happens is a plant is going to release pollen grains, but it's going to hold on to its egg. So the egg is going to hang out on the plant while it releases its pollen spores into the air. Wind or animals can deliver pollen from one seed plant to another, and when it does that, this is called pollination. So the delivery of that pollen grain to an egg-bearing part of the seed plant, which will lead to fertilization. This is a great picture from your book. So if you can see, the microspore in the pollen sac is going to develop into the pollen grain, and then that pollen grain is going to leave the plant, and it's going to end up on another plant where it is going to fertilize the megaspore, which turns into an egg. And once pollination occurs, you get a seed or an embryo. Gymnosperms are vascular seed plants that produce seeds on the surface of ovules. Basically, the seeds are naked. An example would be a pine cone. There is no fruit around the seed. So this includes conifers, cycads, ginkgos, and gonidophytes. So gymnosperm is a seed plant that does not make flowers or fruits, but rather makes pine cones. In conifers, the ovules form on the surface of the woody cones, and they typically have needle-like or scale-like leaves. So I always think of these pine trees. And what's cool is they tend to be resistant to drought and cold. So if you want to look at the life cycle of a pine tree, instead of reading all these words, what you could do is watch the video. But basically what happens is inside the pine cone is the ovule. And the male cones, there's male cones and female cones. And the male cones will eventually release their pollen. And when the male cones release their pollen, as soon as that pollen grain gets into a female cone, it will go through the ovule tissue and deliver the sperm to the egg. When fertilization finally occurs, what's going to happen is an embryo is going to occur, and the seed will be released and germinate and grow into a new pine tree. Again, all of this is animated in the video below. So gymnosperms are seed plants that make pollen grains that allow fertilization to occur even in dry times. They also make eggs in an ovule that develop into a seed. And gymnosperms, such as pine trees, are seed plants with naked seeds. Their seeds do not form inside an ovary. Angiosperms are seed plants that make flowers. So gymnosperms, no flowers. Angiosperms make flowers and fruits. Angiosperms are the largest seed plant lineage, and they're the only group that makes both flowers and fruit. So any fruit tree or fruit plant is going to be an angiosperm, and any plant that flowers. A flower is a specialized reproductive shoot of a flowering plant, and fruit is the mature flowering plant ovary encloses a seed or seeds. So a flower consists of modified leaves arranged in a concentric whorl, and those would be your petals. If you didn't know this, petals are actually modified leaves. And then you have a stamen, and a carpel, and an ovary. The stamen is what produces pollen or the sperm. The egg form in the female part of the flower called the carpel, and the ovary at the base of the carpel holds one or more ovules. So these are your stamens here. This long thing in the middle is your carpel, and inside is your ovary. Again, here we go. So the stamen is the male reproductive part of a flower. That's going to be the part that holds the pollen. These are your stamens. Your carpel is the female reproductive part of the flower. I think of that as like the the tube that leads to the egg. So here we have the carpel, and then here is the ovary, or basically where the egg is held inside the plant. Many flowering plants have co-evolved with pollinators, and a pollinator is an animal that moves pollen from one plant to another. After pollination, a flower's ovary becomes a fruit that contains one or more seeds. So if you've ever noticed on your satsuma plants, everywhere there's a flower is where a satsuma can grow. A flowering plant includes an embryo and an endosperm, nutritious tissue. So basically, when you eat that satsuma, the sweet, delicious part is the endosperm, and then you have the embryo or seeds on the inside. There are two major lineages that differ in seed plants. There are monocots, and monocots include orchids, palms, lilies, and grasses. And then you have eudicots, which are tomatoes, cabbages, roses, poppies, and most flowering shrubs and trees and cacti. So monocots are a lineage of angiosperms. And what happens is they do not produce a true wood, and they include grasses, orchids, and palms. And a eudicot is a lineage of angiosperms that include herbaceous plants, woody trees, and cacti. So here's a picture of monocots. A lot of grasses, whereas eudicots are going to be a lot more of these pretty flowers. Dominant plants in most land habitats, flowering plants are ecologically important and essential to human existence. If you guys have ever watched the Bee Movie, I think it makes it pretty clear that angiosperms or flowering plants are extremely important, as are their pollinators. Angiosperms feed and shelter animals, and they provide us with food, fabric, oils, medicines, drugs, and much more. Angiosperms provide food and shelter for a variety of animals. This hummingbird is sipping nectar, which is mainly sugar from a flower. Also, angiosperms as a crop, nutrient-rich endosperms of angiosperm seeds are staples in human diets. Think about it. Apples, oranges, lemons, limes, those are all the endosperm of these different seed plants. Also, angiosperms supply us with fiber, wood, and oils, including cotton and hemp. And some flowering plants make secondary metabolites that we use in medicines or as mood-altering drugs. So an example of metabolite would be aspirin. These are chemicals that have no known role in the plant, may deter predators, but we use them for various things. So angiosperms or flowering plants are the most recently evolved seed plants. They alone make flowers, and their seeds form inside a floral ovary that develop into a fruit. And angiosperms are the most widely dispersed and diverse group of plants. If you want to learn more about ancient grains and how to keep our plant diversity, this is a super cool video where they show where all the seeds of the world are kept, which is in a bunker in Antarctica. So what should you know from this chapter if you make a study guide? You should know what were the structural adaptations, life cycle adaptations, and reproductive adaptations that a protist had to go through to become a land plant. You'll be able to characterize the seedless vascular plants and their success in dry climates. What kind of plant is a gymnosperm and how does it get fertilized? And discuss why angiosperms are the most successful of all plants presently found in regard to dispersion and diversity. How do they get fertilized? What are the various parts of the flower? And what impact do these plants have on our society? And these are your key terms.